Legends and Luminaries. I'm Julie and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today's book is called Helltown, The Untold Story of a Serial Killer on Cape Cod by Sherman. And I could not stop reading it. I've read a lot of true crime. I avoid the typical true crime books like those by Anne Rule or even Jerry Bledsoe. I used to read Jerry Bledsoe when I was in high school, but now I prefer true crime books written from a personal perspective or lawyers or some other fashion. I don't like the style of writing of the typical true crime book. It's difficult to explain, but there's a formula that goes into writing those. After reading Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, I much prefer that style, one that unfolds more like a story than a hard copy episode. I think that's because I prefer watching those limited series that are based on true stories that I can research on my own after. Sometimes I'll watch the documentary, sometimes I won't. Maybe that goes back to my days of watching all those made-for-TV movies that Lifetime played on repeat that were based on a true story. So that was one reason I picked up Helltown. When I opened the book, it looked more like a novel than a true crime book. But the other reason was the writerly connection. Kurt Vonnegut and Norman Mailer also factor into the story because they both want to write about Tony Costa, the murderer who has dismembered at least 4 different women's bodies and buried them in the woods in the Cape Cod. I enjoyed Slaughterhouse 5. You might remember this book, although it was not my favorite book. And I know of more Norman Mailer based on his Maryland book. Sherman's stories all happens in 1969, a year I know a lot about. My parents talked a lot about those times. I took a Vietnam War class in college, another one all about the 60s, and read up on JFK and what happened after he was assassinated. And just last summer, read Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, which I did a Booksmart episode on. Helltown had my name written all over it, and I was not the least bit disappointed. In fact, this may be a keeper, at least for a little while. I'm going to read you the end of the prologue so you get a taste of how the book begins and Sherman's writing style. He, Costa, returned to his cramped first-floor cell with its double bunk, exposed metal toilet, and small writing desk and sat himself in front of an old borrowed typewriter, the machine he had used to write nearly 400 pages over the past several months. Finally satisfied with the narrative structure of his uniquely twisted story, Costa landed on a title for his manuscript. He struck the keys with his fingers, typing the word resurrection in bold letters. On the next page, he wrote, "Truth demands courage, and rather than live a life of illusion, together we persistently sought the spiritual truth of life, and our search is only the beginning." He stared down at the thin piece of white writing paper with a grin of satisfaction. He was sure that the book would become a runaway bestseller. He wanted to be remembered not as a killer of young women, but as a writer and a thinker who had helped to define the age of Aquarius for a whole generation of readers. In his mind, this book would also cement his legacy as one of Cape Cod's great novelists, mentioned in the same breath as Kurt Vonnegut Jr. and Norman Mailer. Tony Costa then typed his name on the title page, yanked the leather belt from his prison-issued denims, and contemplated his next move. I'm hooked. As much true crime as I have read and watched, I've never heard of Tony Costa before. I realize that our world is full of crime and it would be impossible to know every single atrocious murder that has ever happened. Yet as the story unfolds, it is comparable to Jeffrey Dahmer or Scott Peterson or etc., etc., etc. Yet there are many reasons Tony Costa's crimes were overshadowed. But first, let me go back to the beginning. Sherman lets the story unfold in mostly chronological order. We do get some background information on Costa and our famous authors, Vonnegut and Mailer, and also the victims. The beginning is a bit choppy as all these stories begin to collide. However, I didn't find it the least bit confusing or even boring. Sherman's writing style is easy and engaging and compelling. It doesn't have the verbose denseness of Capote, which I found a bit distracting in Cold Blood. At the end of the book, Sherman said he was inspired by Quentin Tarantino and how he reimagined the Manson murders. I can readily see that in how Helltown unfolds. The story doesn't stop to give us a ton of details in regards to setting or analysis of the characters. Sherman does this seamlessly as the real people in the story are doing whatever it is they are doing wherever they're at to move the story along. I don't want to spoil all of the story for you, but this isn't a case of whodunit. We know Costa's the killer, but we are unsure just how many victims there are. Costa has murdered at least 4 women, rapes them, dismembers them, and buries their body outside a cemetery near Provincetown. The police are onto him pretty quickly, so the story doesn't revolve around trying to figure out who did it because the police have already figured all that out. The story is more about how Costa's murders wrap into the history of the times and of Cape Cod and its people. Sherman presents the police and the lawyers and even our famous writers as archetypes archetypes at times, which works well within the story. The case itself is fascinating, but I'm even more intrigued as history collides with Costa's case, although it isn't history at that time, just bigger news. Ed Dinas is the prosecutor on the case, and he wants fame. He exaggerates and outright lies to the media about the details of the case, as if severed heads needed any embellishing. He knows the Costa case will make him famous, and according to Sherman, maybe even get him into Hollywood. And then Chappaquiddick happens. I am very familiar with this from all of my Kennedy books. Ted Kennedy is drunk driving a car that goes over a bridge with a woman in the passenger seat. He saves himself while she drowns. He goes back to his cabin and pretends like nothing has happened. The woman, Rosemary, didn't drown. She suffocated, meaning if Ted Kennedy had either tried to save her or call for help, she wouldn't have died. Dinas is devastated, not about the death, mind you, but now he will have to cower down to the powerful Kennedys while the public will want blood. He's in a no-win situation. And then less than a month later, well, you can probably guess what happens. The Manson murders. No wonder Costa's murders receive zero attention. But this is where the story collides with all of these intricate details and connections. Linda Kasabian was from Cape Cod, and she provides her testimony in the Manson murders in exchange for immunity. It was girls like Linda who took off to California in the age of hippiedom that is partly the reason the cops didn't take any of Costa's missing girls seriously. And Costa has his own entourage of impressionable girls, Sadie, Thumper, and Strawberry Blonde, who follow Costa outside court like the Manson girls, except the Cape Cod girls are more into witchcraft and such. Mailer may or may not have had a run-in with one of them, but I'll let you read all those details yourself. I wonder if the Manson murders would have happened even a few months later, and what would have then happened to the Costa case in terms of how we remember it. My only complaint with Sherman's storytelling is that parts aren't quite true. At the end, he tells us one part he made up. I don't want to spoil the plot twist for you, so I won't. But there's an incident with a cat that I'm curious about, but I don't know how much of that is true. While Sherman provides notes for each chapter about the sources he used, those notes don't specify everything. Otherwise, the book was just screaming limited series. I imagine Ryan Murphy getting a hold of it and turning it into something fabulous simply because of all the historical connections and literary connections and the gruesomeness of it all. And then at the end, Sherman lets us know that an Amazon limited series is in the works already. I just adore when that happens. When I found FX's feud, Capote and the Swans, I was delighted as I had read that book last year. Helltown will make a wonderful series. Sherman has written many other true crime historical books. I've even run across them at bookstores before, but I haven't read any of them. His aunt was the last victim of the Boston Strangler. 2 of his books are about the Boston Strangler, which I did an episode on that. Not one of his books, but a different book a few weeks ago on Booksmart. Sherman tells us that Helltown is the first time he's tried out this sort of writing style using more of a narrative novel-like structure, and that it was a challenge for him. He definitely succeeded. Sherman took news articles, court documents, and transcripts, police reports, and did some interviews himself. He even had access to Tony Costa's book, Resurrection, which he wrote in prison that details the murders. Helltown recreates what happened, how all those lives intersected, and archives what happened to those women. I'm keeping Helltown for now. I have a true crime case from the 70s that happened where my grandparents lived that I researched a couple summers ago. I have the court documents and such and the records and transcripts, but not the police records because they refused to give them to me. In any case, once I gathered all that info, I didn't really know how to go about writing it, even though I saw it as a limited series in my mind. There are so many twists and turns. It's a soap opera. There's even buried money reminiscent of Fargo. Now, after reading Helltown, I love Sherman's style. It's quick, it's engaging, and nothing is lost by using such narrative structure. I would love to say I found my new summer project, but I already have about 10 projects slated for the summer. Maybe it will be my winter project for next year. Ultimately, Helltown is a must-read. Whether you like true crime or not, whether you like fiction or nonfiction, Helltown is a mix of all of it. An incredibly intriguing story that you won't want to stop reading, that you won't be able to stop reading. And knowing that it's a true story is the icing on the cake. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.